Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, we have Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome for the first time our special guest at this week, Almut Möller, who is the EPC's new Director for European and Global Affairs and head of its Europe in the World programme. Great to have you with us, Almut, as we assess the implications of the European Parliament's vote yesterday on a second term for Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President, and examine the newly published political guidelines, and also then take a look at hugely significant elections both in Europe and around the world this year. So lots to discuss, a packed programme. As always, totally interactive discussion. If you have any questions, either put them in the Q&A box or you can click on the raised hands button and I will give you the microphone when the time comes. Can I make my plea, as always, to make your questions as brief as possible so that I can see very quickly what you want to know and who you want to know it from. So let us start with that vote yesterday in the European Parliament. There had been, Janis, widespread predictions that she might struggle, that this would be very tight, very narrow. In the end, it wasn't. It was much more comfortable than last time. What do you think we should read into that, and also into how the different groups were positioning themselves in the run-up to the vote?
Well, first of all, I think that in the days, weeks before the election yesterday, there were less question marks as to whether she will get a majority. I think 2-3 months ago, there was a strong questioning as to whether she will be able to get the 361 votes. But in the days before, I think that these voices became less and less. Now, there was not clarity as to how good of a result she would get, and the 401 votes is a good result. And I think that had to do with two things. One, the way she played it. I think she had to make a lot of concessions, but she was able to do that. And when it comes to these things, I think she knows how to politically maneuver and make sure that she gets as much support as she can. So she made a very balanced political guidelines, a list of things that need to be done. But the second reason, and I think that also gives us a picture of what it might mean in terms of the future, the second reason why she got that majority is that there was a fear that if there would not be a majority for her, that would send the wrong political signal, also the wrong political signal in extremely volatile times. And let's not forget that would have led to a totally new timetable, which would have which have moved us very close to the US elections. So nobody wanted to give that negative signal. And the other signal was that we want to showcase that there is a pro-EU majority in the European Parliament, that there is a cooperation among the mainstream parties. And if you look into the vote, you had support from the EPP, the Socialists, the Liberals, but also from the Greens. That was one of the question marks, but you also got support from the Greens. And I think that last but not least, there was also the question, if she would not get a majority, what would happen thereafter? Who would be the candidate? Would it be a better candidate? Would that candidate have higher chances of getting a majority? And I think a lot of people thought that this would not be the case.
So in the end, stick with what you know and give predictability and certainty to this process. We'll come back on the issue of the concessions that she had to make in a moment. But Almut, she said in the political guidelines, the next 5 years will define Europe's place in the world for the next 5 decades. She outlined how she thinks Europe can respond to that. Do you think that she will, given that this is her second term, does what you've seen from the guidelines, what she said in the Parliament, indicate that she will be perhaps stronger in giving that political leadership during this second term, particularly as she didn't have to make concessions? She made concessions to the centrist groups rather than others. How do you read the implications of this for her approach to the next 5 years?
Well, looking at her when the results were sort of came up, you could see the sense of relief, but also the sense of empowerment. Here is a politician, very experienced at national and European level by now, who knows that she brought about a majority, a good majority, an important majority at this point in time. as Janis pointed out. So I think with that confidence, and it was overall a very important moment for the European Parliament. We should talk about, of course, what that means for the coming years. Things won't look that easy, because on the overall fault line of are you in or are you out, are you for a strong supranational union or not, this was the fault line yesterday, and she rallied behind her all those forces that want to follow her on that one. But when it comes to more granular sort of decisions and legislation that needs to be adopted in the coming years, that will look a lot more difficult, I assume, and we'll probably talk about that. But for her, I think, and for the European Parliament, this was a very important moment, and she'll thrive on that. She can take that under her wings, and that doesn't make her job easier, not at all. But with the overall constellation within the European Union and internationally, this vote was a very important signal. And yes, she can come in now with the confidence of having done this already, and that is her last round. So I expect her to take a bold approach. She has to. She has no alternative to that.
It's interesting to me that we've talked a lot about how fragmented this new European Parliament is, but when you looked at the vote for Metsola, the president vote, staggering majority. I think it was 562 out of 699. So maybe, Fabian, this parliament, this is all a sign that this parliament will be able to function effectively. And there were many concerns after the election results that they would not. But she did have to make a lot of concessions, as Janis mentioned. I love the phrase from one MEP who said it was, quotes, like a plate full of cookies for almost everybody from the majority. In terms of what that means for the next 5 years, Fabian, how do you read it? I mean, are these concessions going to cause her problems? And Janis described the political guidelines as very balanced. Is that because there's something for everybody? How do you see the next 5 years in light of those guidelines and in light of what's happened?
I mean, firstly, I wouldn't be so confident reading from the performance of the parliament in this vote to the actual votes on policy issues, because there are still very many differences between, also within the centrist coalition. So it will get more difficult, and it will get particularly difficult on substance issues where there's a stake. And in particular, the one we all should be looking ahead to already is the multi-annual financial framework and the fight for money, which is going to be rather bitter and rather difficult between all of the different groups. But when it comes to the political guidelines, yes, you can describe it as a plate of cookies. There is something for everyone. I would describe it still as a Christmas tree. There are a lot of things there, but the question still remains of how do you actually deliver this, and how do you deal with the inevitable trade-offs you have between different areas. Now, I would suspect that some of the things which we see in the guidelines will rather quietly die away. There will be a working group, there will be maybe a commissioner which has a particular job title, but in reality, very little will be delivered. She has got the vote now. She doesn't need to maintain that kind of coalition in the strict sense. But I think there's also an impossibility to deliver everything which is there. Because the reality is that we have very, very hard choices ahead of us. So when she entitled this Europe's choice, it is not a simple choice between being pro-European, a strong supranational element, or against that. It is actually about making many of the hard choices on specific policies and delivering the how, not the what.
Okay, Almut, you wanted to come back here on this issue of the guidelines. I think this is the first time we've seen a real negotiation between a commission president seeking parliamentary votes and the final political agenda. Is there something strange about this beast?
Well, I think in some ways it is, and in some ways it's actually quite an interesting one, because if you look at the sort of the more national environments that we have known in our democracies, then you have this kind of responsiveness with regard to parliament, and then forming majorities that would then, put the executive in place, and then you have a platform on which you basically present what you're about to do, and that is usually something where you feel, okay, there's not much room to sort of deviate from probably as you go along. Differences in member states apply, of course, but this document and the way it came about was her instrument to put together an important a rallying call, and this will be used also with the groups in parliament that supported her. And I think she will run into problems because this document served a very important purpose for her. But then I think when it comes to legislation in the future, we will see, differences, and she will be taken responsible for this framework that she put out, and she will probably find it more difficult to go back to that. So this is a breathing document, and yet she spent a lot of time negotiating, even didn't go to the United States to attend the NATO summit, prioritized. So that, I think, was a very encouraging sign of a maturing sort of political system that we're seeing. It sounds abstract, but in political terms, it's important, I think.
I want each of you to highlight one thing in terms of the priorities and the new commissions and so on in a moment. But Janis, you wanted a brief one, if you would, because we're going to have to move on from this shortly.
But first of all, I hope that Almut is right, that in her second term, she will be bolder, that she will be showing the leadership that some people were missing in the first 5 years, her being in action. She can be more confident because there won't be a third term. But let's see how confident and how much leadership she will try to showcase at the European level beyond the Commission, where in the Commission she will clearly show a lot of leadership. Second, I think both in the guidelines, but also in the speech, you can see that, yes, it is a Christmas list, but there are 2-3 things that she put higher on the agenda. And one is definitely competitiveness. It was a lot about competitiveness. And it was a lot about security and defense, with some mentioning of climate change, with some distance, the climate change issue. By the way, it's also mentioning in the political guidelines. So the question is, if it is competitiveness and security defense, which are her top priorities, will she actually try to deliver on these ones? Because there will be the trade-offs which Fabian talked about. Will she not show leadership in terms of trying to implement what she believes are the most important things, or will she not? And the last point about the supranational EU was very interesting to see. When she referred to in her speech about the need for treaty change where it can improve the union, you did not have a strong sign of support from the members of the European Parliament. There were some who were clapping, but not.
We're going to have to move on in a moment. We're going to have to, but Fabian, I just wanted to ask you particularly about the clean industrial deal. This seemed to be part of this element of straddling, preserving the Green Deal, which she managed to get the Greens on board, and this issue of competitiveness and so on. How significant is it in practice? And one, I don't know whether anyone, I was quite surprised by, was the emphasis she put on affordable housing, which I've never seen as an EU issue competence. So I was a bit, I was quite taken aback by that, whether that's hugely significant or not. But Fabian, on the clean industrial deal and this balancing act, you talked about the trade-offs, nowhere more than here.
I don't think what we have here is significantly deviating from the path which we were on, which essentially is, yes, preserving the Green Deal, because clearly the Green Deal is also one of the major achievements of Ursula von der Leyen in her first term. So there was never going to be a turning back on the Green Deal itself. But the question has always been how far the implementation of that is now going to be at the forefront. And what all of this indicates, I would say, is that competitiveness takes a higher ranking in comparison to the green issues.
Quick ones, if you would, in terms of what you would highlight as most significant and what we know. We know there are new portfolios. You mentioned the Commissioner for Defence, one for housing, one for the Mediterranean, and intergenerational fairness. So we know that much. Almut, what would you highlight as anything that surprised you or struck you particularly?
2 things. Firstly, on the commissioners, the housing, she understands what European citizens are telling us. And that is why she puts it forward. We see in polls that this is what citizens across Europe are hugely concerned about. And she's a responsive Democrat in that way. So I think it's positive. Mediterranean, you mentioned as well. I think it's really surprising how much there was sort of lack of focus on this part of our neighborhood. And she brings that back to the agenda. Interesting. Most interesting for me in the way that she spoke and addressed this parliament was when she talked about a prime minister traveling on a mission that he identified for himself and was very clear without being very explicit what her view on that was.
Let me come to that in a moment.
And so, you know, she interacted with the plenary, she interacted with the wider public, she interacted with member states. I think it was a very interesting way of speaking.
Thank you. Janis.
On housing, it was a clear call from the socialists. That's what they wanted. That's what they got. I think it was interesting that she mentioned one vice president position for implementation, simplification, and interinstitutional relations. So that shows you that there's a lot of emphasis on implementation. And we have been talking about that for a while, which goes back to the question of actually how much we'll be able to implement from everything she has put into her guidelines, giving especially the budgetary concerns and also the tight budgetary situation also in the member states, and that there's a strong emphasis on simplification, which we've also seen in the past. This is nothing new. And by the way, often when you have these let's simplify things at the European level momentum, that was then followed by even more proposals. So let's see how much will actually come out of this. But it's interesting that you mentioned that explicit vice president. Absolutely. Which means that she also has something in mind when it comes to this.
Let us move on to the Prime Minister she didn't name. Yeah, really brief, Fabian. We're already running well over.
Just on housing, I would just say, let's be very careful, because for me, it sounds like something where we don't have any instruments at the European level. So promising something without being able to deliver is dangerous. And what was missing for me was an explicit question about how do we deal with the need for EU level borrowing. I think that is the big elephant in the room, which we didn't see.
She referred to Draghi, yeah?
Sorry, we got to move on. We are already running over. Then we're going to make this a quick one. One question to each of you. And let me stay with you, Fabian, first on the Prime Minister, whose name she didn't mention. In terms of the EU's reaction to Viktor Orbán's visit to Putin, to Xi Jinping, to Trump, without EU authorization, without a mandate, but using the presidency logo, we've heard that there's already a boycott of presidency meetings in Hungary by commissioners and several member states. How serious is this?
I don't think it is serious in terms of the organizational structure of the union. I think it is serious in the way we portray ourselves to the rest of the world. I think what people are seeing is, at best, that Europe is very much divided. At worst, they think that Orbán does represent what Europe thinks. That is not a very helpful message, especially in a world which is so volatile, so difficult, and where we are now facing an even greater chance that it will be a Trump 2 presidency. So we should see this also as a sign of things to come, because if Trump is back in the White House, one of his first callers is going to be Viktor Orbán.
And indeed, he has gave him a name check in his speech yesterday. Janis, in terms of what the EU can do about it, we have some MEPs calling for the suspension of Hungary's voting rights. First of all, is that legal in this context? Feasible, politically the wise response? And is there anything else the EU can do? And then, Almut, I'd like to come to Ukraine and his peace plan after that. But Janis, in terms of what more the EU could do, is there anything they can do realistically?
Well, actually, in the case of Orbán's Hungary, we have had this debate for a long time, so it's not new. And the question is, how far do you always go? I think the smartest way of dealing with him was when we were dealing with him politically, when we were sidelining him and we were sending the signal towards him, but also to the rest of the world. It is 26 versus 1. If you create these kind of situations where he is isolated, I think that is the best way of dealing with it. I think one needs to be careful not to give him too much attention, because that's exactly what he wants. He wants to have that attention. He wants to politically score. So one needs to get a clear signal. Also, the fact that von der Leyen didn't mention his name yesterday, I think was a smart move of doing it, because everyone knew who it was about. But, I don't even put his name in my mouth. So that was good. And I think that's the way one needs to react to him. But having said all that, obviously this is politically dangerous, and he's fully betting on Trump. And in case there is a Trump 2, we have even more of a problem, and he will then be there saying, look, I told you so, and this is why you need to believe in what I think needs to be done. That's bad news for Ukraine, and that's very bad news for the EU too.
Yeah, and we're going to come back on the Trump election, but bad news for Ukraine, Almut. This so-called peace plan that Orbán says he's put together after his talks with Russia. He also visited Zelensky. How damaging do you think this is in terms of the EU's capacity to maintain strong support for Ukraine? How do you read the impact on that debate within Europe, if any, or will it simply be dismissed as this is Orbán playing his games and we can ignore it?
I assume so. The strategy has been to make it a 26 plus. And part of that happened yesterday when Ursula von der Leyen spoke in the European Parliament. She called it an appeasement plan. If we look at the usual practice within the European Union, this was a very brazen move by Viktor Orbán, violating rules, violating good custom. And the trust issue was probably no longer relevant because he didn't have much trust left, but he can be destructive. And one way of handling that is, of course, to not give it attention. So I almost feel inclined, not to talk about substance here, but one thing I believe we need to keep in mind, and Ursula von der Leyen said all the right things, that of course, Ukrainians are the ones that long for peace the most. And there is also a portion, of course, of citizens across the European Union who would wish for that and who are not Trumpists or Orbánites. To play with that is actually very dangerous. And my sense is, and I'd love to be a fly on the wall when sort of EU member states are sitting together these days, I think the temperature is very high now, and the outrage, I think he crossed a line. He really crossed the line. And I think he will just be somewhat a loose cannon in the coming months, seize the opportunities that showing, his forging alliance, etc., etc. And this is something that we haven't seen in the Union yet. And I would be betting that the other member states are more prepared to be more confrontational if need be, not necessarily in public, politically addressing this. And this can potentially be very damaging.
Thank you very much, Almut. Let me stay with you now in terms of the US elections. We've already touched on that, but that real sense now, particularly in the wake of the assassination attempt. Some, although the opinion polls aren't quite reflecting this, now seeing Trump's victory in November as inevitable. And also the choice of J.D. Vance as his running mate, the most isolationist senator there is. What implications do you think this has for the geopolitical landscape more generally, but particularly just staying with Ukraine, for what the EU will need to do if we see the US back away entirely from supporting Ukraine?
I think we've all found ourselves in this situation commenting in the run-up of US presidential elections. And I've tried to belong to those who said, yes, of course, it's hugely important for us, but regardless of what's happening, and it is probably more likely that Donald Trump will return to the White House at this stage, regardless of who's in, Europeans need to take security, at least of their own continent, a lot more into their hands. And this for me is the most important conversation that we need to have. It is interesting and of course relevant and poses a lot of questions what is happening in the United States, but I think the work at home is what we need to focus on politically, analytically, in terms of resources. We are already in a situation where the United States is sort of not necessarily overlapping with what we believe are European interests, and the bigger sort of global questions of how to preserve multilateralism. There is a whole number of areas where I think we can be useful to the future of a transatlantic alliance, in particular within NATO, which will be hugely significant. And you're right to point out that with his running mate, there will be a very difficult time ahead. Especially on Ukraine, what we can do is to take seriously our commitment within NATO as EU Europeans and show future United States leaders that Europe is actually in. We don't have a choice. And so this would be the perspective that we should be taking at this stage.
Janis, you have often lamented the lack of progress on security and defence, and as you've already mentioned, a key plank of Ursula von der Leyen's political guidelines. Do you believe it will provide this imminent threat of a Trump 2 that on these issues is incredibly difficult to do? Does this provide the impetus that you have long been calling for? And more broadly, Fabian, is the EU doing enough to prepare for the possibility, some, as I said, saying inevitability of a Trump 2? But Janis, particularly on security and defence, picking up on what Almut said.
Actually, I'm not sure, because we have been talking about this scenario for a while. Remember back in December, when you had another moment where the polls were very positive for Trump and people were saying, oh, he might really become president again. There was a panic end of last year, but then things calmed down again because numbers looked not as bad for Biden, and there was a feeling, oh, we'll get around it. And as Almut was indicating, actually, independent of who will win the race in November, we need to prepare. Are we? I don't see that we're doing that. And I'm not even sure that we will if we now assume that it's inevitable. I do not think, by the way, that it is inevitable. We hear from DC that there's a good chance that during this weekend that Biden will step down, that he will not endorse Harris, that there will be an open race until the Democratic Convention, which is happening in a month's time in Chicago. So a lot can still happen. Nothing is inevitable, but independent of the outcome. But we need to prepare ourselves. But and by the way, even for those who say that the chances are high that he will get back into the White House, you still hear people say, we will manage. We managed the first 5 years around. And I think this is extremely naive, because Trump 2 is not going to be like Trump 1. So it's extremely naive to hear these things still. And I fear that we are not having the impetus which is actually needed. By the way, the impetus which is mostly needed is to provide the Ukrainians with ammunition. And that all needs time. They need to be produced. We're talking about massive amounts of numbers, especially if the US side doesn't produce or provide the ammunition which the Ukrainian needs. So I'm not sure that we're feeling the heatness as hot as it is.
Fabian, would you agree with Janis? Are you equally pessimistic? Let's not spend more time dwelling on whether he will or will not win. We will see. But in terms of preparing for that possibility. And then I'm going to take a question from our audience. Rui Dang has his hand up, so I'll come to you in a moment, Rui, and then we're going to move on to the French elections. But your reading of where we are and the EU's capacity to deal with a Trump 2, Fabian.
I think the big question is, will Trump 2, either the threat of it or the reality of it, change what we do, and in particular make us do the kind of things which we've been talking about for a long time. Up to now, we have been much better at talking than at delivering. I think the threat of Trump 2 might lead to a situation where countries come together and say, we now have to do certain things. And it certainly is starting to also change the debate to some extent, because we are now talking about Ukraine's security as a European issue, not just as a NATO issue, but something which is inherently European and which is necessary regardless of who's in the White House. But does that lead to the actions which need to be done? And our track record up to now is not very good. And I think this is the real worry, that ultimately we will just continue to try to muddle through, try not to make the difficult decisions, try not to have this discussion with our populations, about the difficult things which will have to be done. And then when it comes, it will be too late. And I think this is the major issue which ultimately is going to be on the table, that you cannot turn around these kind of issues in the last moment. You have to have a much longer perspective on them.
Okay, let us take a quick question from Rui Dang. Rui, can you hear me? Unmute yourself and fire away. Are you there? Okay, we're not hearing from him at the moment. Justus Schönlau, are you there?
Yes, I am. Just a quick one. Sorry, it's going a little bit back on what you were talking on before, but it's directly linked, of course. When Ursula was speaking on the treaty change possibility, and I also noted that the applause was at best lukewarm, but it's curious that she said where it can improve the functioning of the union, because why would you change the treaty otherwise? But what do you think she had more concretely in mind? Was it, for instance, mainly QMV in the council, or did she have other things in mind? Thanks.
Thank you. Who can pick up on that one? Almut? Janis? No, Janis, fire away.
Yeah, no, I don't think that they have anything concrete on their mind. They are very, or she is very cautious. She has been cautious in the past. So she qualified treaty reform in order to be able to say, well, we still need to see where we need it. There obviously is going to be the review process, the review of policy process in view of enlargement. I think that's going to be the moment where one actually needs to identify if that requires potentially also a reform of the EU treaties. My guess is that you will not have a strong amount of push towards treaty change, even when that review is being done. The preview that was done a couple of months ago also was indicating potentially changes to the EU treaties and to the governance structures of the EU. And there, the von der Leyen Commission 1 was even further back than in terms of the level of ambition compared to what the Juncker Commission was asking for. I don't see that there will be a strong push because member states don't want it.
Okay, Paul Taylor. Paul, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, yes, thank you. Fabian rightly mentioned that Ursula von der Leyen omitted any mention of collective borrowing, which is clearly one of the important issues facing the next commission. Will there ever be a good moment politically for her to raise this? How and when do you expect her to address this need? I mean, will it have to be after the whole commission has been through its hearings and mentioned nothing about it, after it's all been confirmed by Parliament? Don't we then get into the German election campaign? It looks like there may never be a good moment to do it. What's your view of that?
Fabian.
I think that necessity will drive that debate. So I think she will avoid trying to talk about it at all, but we are going to get to the point where it becomes inevitable. And that in particular will be in connection with the next EU budget, which will clearly be insufficient to cover all of the priorities which are there. But I would expect it will have to come from the member states, and then she will pick it up. I don't think she will push it by herself.
It is striking, though, that in the section of the political guidelines on delivering together and preparing our union for the future, a new budget fit for our ambitions, was what the first thing she highlighted there. Very quick, last one before we move on. Andres Pedersens, and perhaps Almut, you can pick up on this. What about, they want to ask about the European political community in the UK. Actually, I'm going to hold on for that because we want to come to the UK in a moment, and let us turn our attention now. We're now taking a look at, so we've talked about the US elections, now the French elections, which produced in the second round an astonishing result. And now, I mean, certain degree, if I can put it this way, of political chaos in France. But an interesting development yesterday, Janis, with the National Assembly re-electing the centrist Macron candidate, which perhaps was not what was expected, but still a lot of arguing over the government, talks of caretaker government for months and so on. How do you read this? Both, I mean, let's not focus on French domestic politics here, but in terms of its impact, the impact of this turmoil in France on the EU and policy making in the EU.
As we've discussed in the past, and I don't think that this has changed over the past days, weeks, and yesterday's interesting result, the one you already referred to. I think in general, from an EU perspective, the outcome of the election, the fact that Macron has to a part been weakened, although I must say that after the result of the 7th of July, there are questions as to whether what he did might still have been something which is not as stupid as some had argued that it was, and whether the gamble he was playing was actually that much of a gamble, especially if you think of 2027, which is what everyone has in mind. But I think there is a leadership problem on the French side, that it has not strengthened the position of France or Macron in the European Union. There is an issue as to whether one can expect that you will see him focusing on EU affairs in future in the same way as he has done. Then there's the other reading, which is also an interesting reading, which is that maybe now, following what one witnessed in the elections, there is the right time to listen even more to some of the proposals of Macron, because it is important in view of 2027 to make progress also at the European level, as he had been pushing for years, even before he assumed the presidencies. So there is a question still out there, whether the 26, or at least a big majority of the 26, will understand that there's also a necessity at the European level to be more ambitious in view of the 2027 presidential elections, which is what everyone is actually fearing. So let's see which of these narratives at the end will prevail. It's still not clear.
Almut, a comment to that if you would, but also in terms of the lessons that we might draw from what happened in France with that massive surge in support for the far right in the first round, and then that coalition, that anti-far right coalition that scored that astonishing results. What would you read into that in terms of the lessons for populist movements around the EU and for those ranged against them? Do you think we can draw broader lessons about the future of populist movements?
Firstly, I think we saw how relevant European Parliament elections are now, and how relevant they can become even for a national government in a key member state. Sort of analytically, I'd say that's good news, because it ultimately strengthens the European democracy that I've been sort of advocating for. But of course, the picture is more complex. And on your specific question, Jacki, of the fringes, I wouldn't even call them the fringes, because fringe sounds small, and a lot of the extreme parties on the left and right are no longer fringes. We need to be very aware that this is happening in member states at a lot of different levels, not in all of them. But this problem is not solved at all. We are awaiting, of course, for regional elections in Germany, one of the key member states as well. The Franco-German collaboration is a question mark when it comes to translating power at EU level. It means that you have to be powerful at home. In the 3 regional elections in East Germany, we will probably see a rise of the far right, to the extent that there is participation in regional governments, with an impact on also the coalition at national level. And so that, I think we really need to keep in mind. This shapes increasingly the ability of EU leaders to travel to Brussels and to kind of manage their own domestic environments. Has become a real art for them, and it should, in a way, of course, worry us, because it probably weakens the European level. But at the same time, I feel it might also have made things a lot clearer. We've seen that in the European Parliament vote yesterday. the choices have become demarcated and very clear, and this can also be a rallying point and a source of energy, which of course I would hope for. But you know, these are interesting months ahead that will impact at the European level as well.
I mean, that rallying point, which we saw with the creation of this alliance, this new Popular Front, Fabian, in France, but now in the aftermath of that remarkable victory for that alliance, just arguing with each other, can't agree who should be the Prime Minister, which is leading to this talk of a long-term caretaker government. So was that response part of the answer that others should draw lessons from, do you think? Or could it backfire in the long run?
Well, I think we are dealing with, in many ways, unprecedented political situations. So what is happening now is not so much a long-term strategy, but it is reactions every step along the way. But it doesn't remove the political realities which are underlying this. And for me, the ultimate problem with this debate is that what we're not really taking into account is this negative downwards ratchet effect, which we're seeing in many countries. That yes, for a moment, we might have escaped the worst possible outcome, but that doesn't mean the long term looks better. It actually means that we are continuing on this downward trend where things are getting more volatile, more uncertain, and where these extremist parties, anti-democratic parties, are continuing to gain ground and are continuing to negatively impact on the ability of the system as a whole, as Almut was mentioning, to make decisions, to work together to address the challenges we have.
Thank you. I'm just going to have another attempt to reach Rui Dang. Hang on, let's see. If you are there, Rui, can you unmute yourself? Can you hear me? No, I'm not having any success there. Let us move on to the UK election, Fabian's favourite topic, as something of an expert on Brexit, but we don't talk Brexit anymore. We talk future EU-UK relations. We've seen a dramatic change in tone since the new Labour government was elected. Already begun work on what it calls resetting relations with the EU, flurry of meetings in the first few days. Come back on the European political community question in a moment. But in concrete terms, Fabian, what do you think? What is your reading of what Keir Starmer really wants from the EU, and what is he willing to give in return? And then we'll come to how is the EU likely to respond. But Fabian, what's your reading of what they really want? A lot of focus on defence, security, a pact. What else do they want, and do they recognise the trade-offs involved for them?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that this mood music, the change in tone, also the very clear engagement of Keir Starmer and his team with European leaders is very welcome and very helpful. Whatever concretely might come next, it is important that there's a clear signal that we're talking to each other and that this is aiming at achieving some common goals, and that also helps to overcome some of the issues which have become very much stumbling blocks for any kind of attempt, including, for example, migration, where the Rwanda scheme has now been killed off by the new government.
So tone is important, but on substance?
Well, on substance, I don't think we are at that stage yet, because both sides are still exploring what can be done. I think it is clear that defense and security is very much a common interest, that there is a lot of a shared agenda between them. So I would think that a defense and security pact is something which is very much on the agenda. But even within that, what does that mean concretely? Because you very quickly also get into difficult issues. For example, in how far is the UK defense industry involved in European procurement, etc. So these are the kind of concrete issues which will come very quickly onto the agenda. But for this moment in time, the question is all about the signaling. It's all about saying, yes, we are going to work together, and yes, these are common interests.
Almut, your reading in terms of how the EU is likely, in substance terms, to respond to these overtures. We've seen a lot of very good photo ops. It's all looking very friendly, very. Do you think the EU is ready? Clearly, there's an interest in security and defence, and they tried very hard to get the UK involved. But as Fabian's saying, trade-offs there for them in terms of the defence industry. What's your reading of when it starts to get to the issues, how the EU is likely to respond? And then Fabian, Janis, I'd like to come to you on the European political community meeting this week. But Almut, your sense of how the member states and the Commission will respond to these overtures?
Yes, I think symbolism at this stage is absolutely important, if not only as a signal to the rest of the world. We cannot afford to look divided, so this is helpful. When it comes to substance, I mean, the EU, the Commission knows very well the UK's position outside of the Union. And in the course of the Brexit negotiations, we've come to learn a lot about what Brexit actually means. So there's a lot of expertise over that, which I hope could be helpful also when we're starting to tackle some of the questions and that involve in particular European security and defense. And I'm not saying necessarily EU, European security and defense, but a European pillar within NATO. We've just pushed out, and I hope this is also okay in my first update to give a bit of advertising. We pushed out a paper yesterday revisiting the old question of, avant-garde groups moving ahead to keep the union's capacity to act. And we threw a stone into the water saying we need such a thing in security and defense, and Poland should be very much a country that could lead on that. And that for me brings up the question what that means for non-EU European countries. And that is, of course, the UK. So I think, there will be politically, I think, off the cards this question of any future accession. The UK doesn't want it. I think the Union, we as much as we say, there is a possibility and we would welcome, et cetera, everybody knows it's not on the cards. And on the sort of more granular questions, yes, there is a willingness, I assume, to make things work because of the existential threats that we've been facing. So overall, good news, and nice to go into the summer with some nice pictures. It's always comforting for Europeans. We know what it means not to have those pictures.
Thank you. And I want to come back on that paper. That there is a link, by the way, just been posted in the chat to that paper, but we're going to come back and discuss it in the last 10 minutes of this update. But Janis, one of the places where we saw those very warm overtures from Keir Starmer was this meeting yesterday of the European political community, hosted in the UK. Andres Peterson's in our audience saying completely overshadowed, as was the NATO summit, by the vote, the von der Leyen vote. I think that's inevitable because that was the most concrete thing that would come out of it. But in terms of the signals that sent about how the UK sees its role within that political community and whether it can bolster the political community, because there's been some doubts about what it's for and can it work, and your reading of that meeting as a whole, and whether it's moved us forward really with this Macron-conceived project.
I think there's one word that comes to my mind when it comes to the European Political Cooperation meeting is symbolism, in the positive sense, meaning that it took place in the UK. It was an opportunity to showcase that the new UK government and its Prime Minister is a different one, and that is not only striking a different tone, but potentially also opening opportunities to cooperate, although it will be difficult. But I believe linking it to something we were discussing earlier with respect to the elections in the US, if actually there is a Trump 2, there will be a lot of need to cooperate with London, and let's see how that will work out. So the symbolism coming out from that was very positive. When it comes to symbolism, there's a second aspect which is more negative when it comes to European political cooperation. It showcased something we had been discussing in the past, that actually we do not know what the European political cooperation is about, what it tries to achieve, what its main aim is. Yes, it is a gathering of bringing people together. That in itself is significant, giving an exchange, a moment among European leaders, so including a lot of non-EU leaders, obviously. So it serves that purpose. But in terms of actually delivering or going beyond that, we have seen that it is extremely limited and that it is being constructed in that way. And the meeting which we just had was signaling exactly that. It's
Doesn't
not
take us
that much
further
about
forward.
concrete
No.
progress.
Indeed. I want to come back in our last 10 minutes on this paper that you mentioned, Almut, and you call in this paper for a super-governmental avant-garde. You all co-authored this paper together, and you called for this more differentiated Europe. And this goes back to our issue about, is the EU willing, ready to take on the massive challenges to do what's necessary? Almut, in terms of, as you raised it, in terms of how this would work, what are you talking about when you, what is the difference between this and conversations about two-speed Europes and also the other discussions about differentiation? You've called it super-governmental. How might this work in practice?
So obviously we wanted to have a bit of fun with lengthy titles, which hopefully won't put too many people off, but would just be seen, at least how I perceive it. It entails a dose of humor, but it entails something very important, and that is we are not arguing for a group of member states to go at the intergovernmental way. We've seen a lot of discussions over the past decades over the need possibly for groups to move ahead. We've had different models, important politicians taking on, adopting this politically in their mandates. It never flew because the risks of doing that are obvious. You might undermine unity and also, the single market as a backbone. You might undermine the EU institutions when you do that. And so in our analysis, we're saying now is the time to conclude that the existential threats that the Union and its members are facing makes us come to a different conclusion, where we see that the risks of a differentiated Europe, this is not actually what we should be emphasizing. The relevant question is whether the EU is able to act or not, and in particular in security and defense. And why we put a supranational avant-garde is because we said, sorry, super-governmental, I should really know titles of my own papers, is because we want to underline that, of course, this does not entail any way, shape, or form to undermining the EU supra-governmental setup. And that, of course, is something that we would wanted to underline. And I think politically, we'd have to test that in member states, including in the one where we thought the leadership could come from, and that is Poland. It's an attempt to restart a debate in a more existential environment.
But you say, Fabian, in the paper, this avant-garde is not, and I'm quoting, an intergovernmental construct, but rather something like a mini EU with binding rules, strong supranational features, and an enhanced involvement of EU institutions. This increases some of those risks that Almut was talking about, but yet you've concluded that's the only way to go. You actually say, alternatively, there is a real risk that the Union as we know it will unravel. Is it that stark, and can the risk be avoided by going down this road, or is it just inevitable?
Yes, it is that stark, because our starting point, as always, has been from the challenges, from the content. What is it we need to do? And when we start from that point of view, we see that the current mechanisms, the current ways of doing things are not delivering what needs to be done. So we have to find different ways of doing it. So this is our attempt of trying to find an alternative route, but trying to find an alternative route where, yes, the risks are present, but where they are minimized. And that's why we're also talking about something like a mini EU, something which behaves like the EU, which is in many ways using the mechanisms, using what is already there, but taking that forward among those countries which are willing to take the next step. And I think it's absolutely necessary, because unless we see this, we run the danger of not making the decisions which are necessary in crucial areas such as defense and security, where the challenge, as we have just discussed, have now become even bigger.
Janis, just in terms of the way you frame this, is this because you have little confidence that we'll get meaningful treaty change that would allow within the normal intergovernmental structures of the EU would allow for progress on these crucial issues like defence. Is this a response to the sense that treaty change is not politically feasible, or is it irrespective of that debate about treaty change?
I don't think that our starting point was the debate on treaty reform, not at all. It was more what both Almut and Fabian were mentioning. We started our thinking about this from an analysis of where we stand and what needs to be done. And the main argument being that we need a much higher level of ambition if we want to be able to confront the new age we live in. And that is a very volatile, uncertain age, which obviously is also profiting some of the political fringes, which correctly Almut was saying earlier actually are more than fringes, because they have in many parts of the EU have now large size of the voters behind them. So the question is, how can you be more ambitious if not all member states are ready to be on board? And what we've seen is that the instruments which the EU treaties provide, enhanced cooperation, permanent structured cooperation, all these instruments are included in the treaties, but they're not being used. And are not being used because there is a fear behind that if they're used, they would create more of a supranational union. There's a fear that some will be left behind. But now I think all these fears and risks, also the risk of disunity or dispelling disunity, that these fears are still valid. But given the moment we live in, we need to have a higher level of ambition. And if not all member states are ready to cooperate, then we need to find a ways of doing that linked to the supranational system while using elements outside of the EU treaties. That's why we link the supra and the intergovernmental with each other, in order to take also away some of these fears. But on the other hand, you need to have that pressure. And that's where Almut is very right when she says, especially in the area of defense, it's no longer the French or the Germans who potentially are the ones who are leading. It might be the Polish and also other countries in Central and Eastern Europe.
Poland,
and we need
because
to find a way.
it assumes Poland, just to follow up, Janis, Poland because it assumes the council presidency in the first half of next year, or more Poland because of its interest in the defense area, which is where you think this should start?
Well, first of all, because Poland is Poland, so we're talking about a big member state with a lot of gravity, a lot of also gravity in Central and Eastern Europe. And we saw that Donald Tusk, at his visit to Berlin, was with cameras on, with mics on, was putting pressure on Scholz. And he was even saying we need to do more on defense, and we need to do it by including also common borrowing. So that you need these pressure moments, and you need to find ways of using these pressures, and they will come not from the traditional actors in many ways, they will come from other actors, but you also need to find a way to do it. And if the EU treaty instruments, which often require consensus, do not allow to do that, you need to find other ways. And this is where we come forward with the supra-governmental avant-garde with clear principles. I think it's important to have in mind that we also define what we consider to be the clear principles. And these clear principles try to adhere to some of the rules of the EU, make sure that EU institutions are involved, that it's open for everyone. It's not the notion of a core Europe. It's not a core plus, it's more 27 minus logic. And that is a big difference. But the question is whether we will have the political will to move in that direction. And that's why we hope with our discussion paper, we push that debate, which we really need in order to live up to the ambitions which we require at the European level.
Just before we close, and we only have a couple of minutes left, but Almut, in terms of the likely response, if you see Poland applying this pressure, and you talk in the paper about weak Franco-German leadership at the moment, and we talked about some of the reasons why it's weak in France at the moment, but we haven't had time to touch so much on the German situation. But what is likely to be the response from Berlin, from Paris? I mean, will they push back or respond to this pressure if it comes from a country like Poland? What's your sense of how politically feasible what you're proposing is?
Yeah, I think that's what we're testing, Jackie, and that's where we need to reach out as think tankers now. And, you know, we need to engage with our partners and constituencies and member states at EU level, and, you know, to see whether that has any relevance. My sense is there is much more appetite for that kind of thinking, and that also has to do with the experience of one prime minister that is a member state of the European Union, not only, but I should mention that. And so, for me, this is really, the proof is in the pudding. We need to reach out and see, and I believe there will be more openness than probably 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago on such questions. But that's the role of think tankers, to help mobilize and work for our ideas and drum up support, and we'll report back.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are out of time. I know we could go on having this conversation. I'm sure we will come back to it in future updates. And as I say, the link to that paper, it's entitled Confronting the Perma Crisis, Time for a Supra-Governmental Avant-Garde. It is difficult to say. Thank you very much. But it's also on the EPC website. If you haven't looked at it yet, please do take a look. Also a discussion by paper by Pavel Svoboda this week on funding Europe's technology revival. We will be back after the summer break with another update in September. But in the meantime, thank you, first of all, as always, to Janis and Fabian, but a particular thank you to Almut. It's great to have you on board. And thank you so much for a great discussion today, all three of you. Thank you for joining us. I wish you a very good summer, and I will see you back here in the autumn for our next update. Take care and have a wonderful summer. Bye.
Thank you.